Ukraine just launched one of its biggest strikes on a Russian site. At first, it looked like Russia's oil defenses would hold, but what happened in the next 10 minutes shocked everyone watching and changed the entire balance in the Black Sea. At exactly 3:10 p.m. under the bright sky, Ukraine launched 84 precision-guided cruise missiles aimed directly at a Russian oil depot on the outskirts of Sochi. This was no random strike. It was a carefully planned operation using a combination of Storm Shadow and domestically modified cruise systems delivered via F-16 platforms and supported by electronic warfare. The goal was clear: cripple Russia's oil logistics, the same network fueling frontline operations in Donbass and supporting long-range bomber missions from Engels Air Base. Ukrainian commanders had spent weeks waiting for the right moment, gathering real-time satellite imagery from EO-1 and Maxar to confirm that at least 10 massive 50,000-barrel storage tanks were fully loaded with petroleum reserves. Those tanks were not only essential to keeping Russia's military running, but also symbolic. Russia had boasted that its southern energy sector was untouchable, too far from Ukraine's immediate reach. But that night, Ukrainian intel saw the perfect alignment, and the order was given. The first wave of missiles crossed into Russian airspace, flying low over the Black Sea, cloaked by KC-135 tanker refuelers that had extended the F-16's reach, and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft jamming Russian radar sweeps. It wasn't long before Russia's vaunted defenses came alive. S-400 batteries locked in, Pantsir S systems swiveled to engage, and OSA launchers were fired in desperate volleys. Radar screens lit up as operators scrambled to track the incoming swarm, firing 40 N6 and 9 M311 missiles at anything they could lock on. But Ukraine's saturation tactic worked exactly as designed. Too many missiles came in from too many trajectories at once. Decoys, programmed to mimic real warheads, confused the radar. Russia's defensive grid buckled almost immediately. By 3:13 p.m., the first storm shadows were already overhead. The opening impact ripped into one of the largest petroleum, oil, and lubricants tanks, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the sky. The explosion was so massive that residents in central Sochi reported windows rattling across entire districts. Seconds later, a second and third missile struck, rupturing adjacent tanks and triggering chain reactions. Within minutes, the oil depot was engulfed in fire. Secondary explosions followed as parked fuel trucks, rail tankers, and underground pipelines burst apart, feeding the inferno. NASA firm's thermal data captured giant heat plumes stretching kilometers into the air, visible even from international satellites. The night sky over the Black Sea lit up as if it were day. Inside Russian command posts, chaos took over. Communications flared with fragmented reports, direct hit on primary tanks, pipeline junction destroyed, fire spreading out of control. Emergency units were scrambled, but the intensity of the explosions made approaching the site impossible. Fire brigades staged kilometers away, unable to get closer due to continuous detonations. Panic gripped local authorities as news spread quickly on Russian social media, despite censorship attempts. Videos from Sochi residents showed massive orange fireballs illuminating the coastline and black columns of smoke rising higher than any building in the city. But here's where it got even worse for Moscow. Russian defenses had fired hundreds of millions of dollars worth of interceptors, yet most failed to stop the strike. Ukrainian planners had predicted this. They knew Russia's defense grid could not handle saturation strikes of this scale. The oil depot, once thought secure, had become a massive firestorm, and this was just the first 10 minutes. At 3:18 p.m., Russia had spent years fortifying this oil depot. It wasn't just a storage site. It was a hub connecting southern fuel pipelines that supplied Engels Air Base, key refueling nodes for bombers, and even command posts in occupied Ukrainian villages. Moscow considered it a backbone of its war economy. Satellite imagery had shown defensive layers built around the depot, S-400 batteries placed on high ground, Pantsir S short-range systems positioned near tank farms, and OSA launchers hidden in camouflaged revetments. The depot itself was reinforced with berms, blast walls, and underground tanks. To Russian commanders, it looked unbreakable, but Ukraine knew those defenses could be cracked. Weeks of intelligence collection, satellite surveillance, intercepted comms, and NATO ISR feeds, revealed blind spots in the radar grid. One radar dish had a known coverage gap at low altitude. That was the path the missiles would take. The Ukrainian strike package was not improvised. It was deliberate and multi-layered. Storm Shadows were chosen for their ability to fly low and evade radar. Domestically modified cruise missiles provided volume. KC-135 tankers extended range, while EA-18G Growlers jammed Russian radar frequencies, forcing operators to waste precious seconds recalibrating. At the same time, Ukrainian ISR drones hovered in international airspace, feeding live data back to command. Every movement was tracked. Every strike had a purpose. As the missiles crossed the Black Sea, Russian radar operators finally saw the first returns. At first, they thought it was routine air clutter. Then the tracks multiplied. Dozens of objects appeared on screens at once. The reaction was immediate. Alarms rang out, interceptors were prepped, and launch commands were given. S-400 crews fired 40 N-6 missiles into the night sky. Pantsir S systems launched 9 M311 interceptors and opened up with 30mm autocannons, filling the air with tracer fire. OSA launchers spat out short-range missiles, their contrails cutting across the darkness. For a moment, it looked like the defenses might hold. At 3:22 p.m., the first missiles reached Russian airspace. Interceptors connected with a handful, detonating in bright flashes over the Black Sea. Debris fell harmlessly into the water. Russian officers reported multiple kills, confident they had blunted the attack. But then the second wave hit. The saturation was overwhelming. Some missiles flew decoy trajectories, forcing Russian interceptors to chase ghosts. Others came in at extremely low altitude, hugging the sea surface where radar struggled to track them. Electronic warfare support added to the chaos, jamming fire control radars and creating false echoes. Operators shouted conflicting reports. One screen showed 20 targets, another showed 50. The command chain was drowning in noise. By 3:25 p.m., missiles were already slipping past the outer defensive ring. Explosions lit up as several struck secondary storage tanks on the depot's perimeter. Fireballs ripped into the sky, followed by shockwaves that rattled buildings kilometers away. Russian emergency sirens wailed across Sochi as residents rushed to windows, capturing footage of the growing inferno. Inside the depot, workers scrambled to escape, abandoning vehicles and equipment as flames spread uncontrollably. But here's where it became even more dangerous. A missile slammed into the pipeline junction feeding fuel directly toward Engels Air Base. The detonation severed the line, igniting fuel under pressure and creating a chain of secondary blasts. A rolling firestorm swept across the facility. Another missile hit a cluster of fuel trucks parked for loading. They erupted in a chain of detonations, throwing flaming debris into nearby structures. Within minutes, half the depot was consumed by fire. Russian commanders had no choice but to issue a general emergency alert. Reports poured in. Primary tanks destroyed, pipeline severed, fire uncontrollable. The depot, once a strategic stronghold, had become a burning weakness, and Ukraine wasn't done yet. By 3:28 p.m., the depot was now a battlefield of fire. The first wave of Ukrainian missiles had ruptured storage tanks, igniting petroleum, oils, and lubricants. Each tank held up to 50,000 barrels. When they exploded, the shockwaves shook the ground for kilometers. Fireballs rose hundreds of meters, turning the night into daylight. Windows shattered across Sochi's outskirts. Residents filmed massive columns of black smoke climbing into the sky. The heat was so intense that emergency responders couldn't get close. Inside the depot, workers who had survived the first blasts fled through burning debris. Fire trucks rushed in but were quickly overwhelmed. Secondary explosions kept erupting as buried pipelines burst under pressure. Some blasts launched fragments of steel across entire blocks. By 3:30 p.m., the inferno had consumed half of the depot. Ukrainian drones orbiting at high altitude streamed live video back to command centers. The images showed dozens of Russian oil tanks collapsing into flames, one after another. Analysts confirmed the strike had achieved catastrophic damage. But Russia wasn't silent. Within minutes, counterfire began. At 3:35 p.m., Russian artillery units launched Smerch and Uragan multiple launch rocket salvos, trying to disrupt any follow-up Ukrainian operations. dozens of rockets arced into the sky, landing near suspected Ukrainian staging areas. But Ukraine had anticipated this. Counter-battery radars picked up the launches immediately. Within minutes, HIMARS crews locked onto Russian artillery positions. At 3:40 p.m., guided rockets streaked across the border. Explosions ripped through Russian MLRS sites, silencing at least 2 batteries before they could reload. Meanwhile, Russian air defense crews scrambled to regroup. A surviving Pantsir S fired at Ukrainian ISR drones, trying to blind their reconnaissance. But the drones were decoys, baiting the system into exposing itself. Seconds later, loitering munitions targeted the Pantsir radar, striking it dead on. Operators never saw it coming. The last functioning short-range defense was gone. At 3:42 p.m., Russian commanders ordered more desperate measures. Su-30 and Su-35 fighters were scrambled to patrol the skies over Sochi, but Ukrainian electronic warfare support had already disrupted comms. Russian pilots reported garbled instructions. Ground radar couldn't distinguish friend from foe. At the same time, SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense, drones loitered just outside the defensive perimeter, ready to fire at any emitter that went active. Russian air defenses were being dismantled layer by layer. By 3:45 p.m., the depot was an uncontrollable inferno. Firefighters couldn't approach within 500 meters. Explosions shook the city every few minutes as new tanks ignited. A nearby pumping station feeding the Druzhba pipeline was struck by debris, forcing a shutdown. Oil flow to parts of Europe stopped instantly. Tanker traffic from the Black Sea was suspended. The disruption was spreading far beyond Sochi. Russian media tried to downplay the disaster, claiming most missiles were intercepted. But satellite thermal imagery from NASA's firms contradicted those claims. The heat signatures were impossible to deny. The blaze was visible from orbit. Ukrainian officials released drone footage within hours, showing massive columns of flame rising from what Moscow had claimed was a secure site. The strike had crippled Russia's fuel reserves in the south, and worse for Moscow, it had exposed the weakness of its so-called layered defenses. Ukraine had not only destroyed the depot, it had demonstrated that no amount of fortification could guarantee safety. Russia's response was just beginning, but the damage was already irreversible. By 4:10 p.m., the battle for Sochi's oil depot was no longer about defending infrastructure. It was about survival. The flames raged so fiercely that even hardened bunkers collapsed. Over 70% of the depot's capacity was gone, reduced to rubble and molten steel. Analysts later estimated millions of barrels of fuel had been destroyed in less than an hour. Drone footage showed a once secure facility now glowing like a volcano, its towers and tanks twisted into burning skeletons. Russia had built it as a fortress for energy security. Ukraine had turned it into a graveyard of fire. The immediate result was devastating. Fuel pipelines were offline. Military convoys in southern Russia reported shortages within hours. Engel's Air Base, a hub for strategic bombers, faced disruptions to jet fuel delivery. Civilian areas too felt the shock. Power grids faltered as emergency fuel reserves were tapped. Oil shipments through the Black Sea froze as tankers were ordered to hold position. Moscow's energy supply network, long considered untouchable, had been pierced at its heart. But the destruction of the depot was more than physical. It carried a psychological weight that rippled through both Russia and the world. State television tried to spin the story, showing archive footage of air defenses firing and declaring most missiles had been intercepted. Yet ordinary Russians could see the smoke with their own eyes. Social media lit up with videos of fireballs in the night sky, shared faster than sensors could delete them. Residents described the sound of explosions echoing for miles, the ground trembling under each detonation, and a fear they hadn't felt since the first days of the war. In the corridors of power, the strike raised harder questions. How could 84 missiles get through supposedly impenetrable S-400 systems? Why were Pantsir crews silenced so quickly? And what did it mean for Russia's ability to protect its other energy hubs, in Rostov, Novorossiysk, and even Moscow itself? For a government that prided itself on strong defenses, the optics were brutal. The image of Russia's shield had cracked. Internationally, the fallout was immediate. Brent crude prices ticked upward as markets digested the scale of disruption. Energy analysts warned that if Ukraine repeated such strikes, the global oil supply could face shockwaves. NATO observers quietly praised Ukraine's ingenuity. Intelligence briefings confirmed that Western-supplied munitions had played a decisive role in the attack, proving how precision warfare could dismantle even hardened infrastructure. Allies saw a message. Ukraine wasn't just defending, it was striking at the very arteries of Russia's war machine. And for Ukraine, the strike was not just about fuel, it was about proving capability. Kyiv wanted to show Moscow and the world that Russia's energy strongholds were vulnerable, that every tank of fuel powering Russian bombers, every drop of oil feeding artillery trucks could be turned into fire. The message was sharp and simple: fuel the war, and your reserves will burn. By dawn, the flames were still burning, visible for miles along the Black Sea coast. Fire brigades worked frantically, but the damage was irreversible. Russia had lost one of its most critical southern depots. Ukraine had scored its most significant energy strike yet. The balance of the conflict had shifted again. For Russia, it was a humiliation. For Ukraine, it was proof of resolve. And for the world, it was a reminder. In modern war, even the strongest fortresses can fall in minutes. This was only the beginning. If it were you, what do you think caused the depot's downfall? Was it the power of 84 missiles tearing through its defenses, or the weakness of Russia's protection around such a critical target? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every idea helps us understand how these strikes shift the balance. If you found this video valuable, hit like and subscribe so you won't miss our next frontline breakdown. This is Navy Point, where every battle tells a story. See you on the next mission.